Right now, deep inside Iranian territory, there's a hole in the ground that used to be an underground command bunker, and the weapon that put it there is the single largest non-nuclear bomb in the entire American arsenal. This is not exaggeration. This is not clickbait dressed up to get you to watch another minute. Over the past several weeks, the United States has carried out one of the most sustained and devastating air campaigns against Iran that anyone has seen in this entire conflict. And the centerpiece of that campaign has been a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb, dropped by a stealth bomber that flew all the way from the middle of Missouri, refueled multiple times in midair, and delivered a strike so precise and so powerful that it reportedly wiped out a concentration of senior commanders from Iran's most feared paramilitary organization in a single blow. So stick with me here, because we are going to walk through exactly what happened, what weapons were used, why this specific target mattered so much, and where all of this is heading. Because the fallout from these strikes is still actively shaping decisions in Washington and in Tehran as we speak. And if you want to actually understand this war, instead of just scrolling past confusing headlines about explosions in the Gulf, go ahead and subscribe. Because this conflict is moving fast, and we are tracking every single development as it happens. Let's start with why any of this is happening in the first place, because context is everything here. Back in June, mediators actually managed to get the United States and Iran to sign onto a memorandum of understanding, an interim framework, designed to formally end the broader war within 60 days. For a few weeks, it actually looked like it might hold. Shipping was moving. Tensions were cooling. And then, at the start of July, Iran decided to test that agreement by striking commercial vessels that were bypassing the specific transit routes it had unilaterally designated as its approved corridors through the Strait of Hormuz. 3 ships were hit in the span of 2 days. That was the moment the fragile peace collapsed. President Trump came out and declared the truce effectively over, and within days, American forces resumed a full-scale bombing campaign, this time explicitly framed around protecting freedom of navigation through one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. You have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means for the global economy to understand why this became such an enormous flashpoint. On a normal day before this war, somewhere around 130 vessels a day were passing through that strait, carrying everything from crude oil to container shipments that keep entire national economies functioning. At its narrowest point, that strait is barely wide enough for 2 supertankers to pass each other safely. Iran cannot defeat the United States Navy in open combat, and nobody seriously believes it can, but it does not need to. All it needs to do is make that narrow channel feel dangerous enough that shipping companies start rerouting, insurance premiums spike, and global markets start to panic about energy supply. That has been the core Iranian strategy from the very beginning of this conflict: hold the world's energy arteries hostage and use that leverage to extract concessions. And for a stretch of time, it was actually working. Traffic through the strait collapsed by more than 90% at the worst points of this latest escalation, dropping to single digits of vessels a day compared to the usual 100 plus. Oil prices briefly spiked above $100 a barrel. That is real, tangible economic pain rippling outward from a relatively narrow strip of water, thousands of miles from most of the people actually feeling it at the gas pump. So when the United States responded, it did not respond with a couple of symbolic missile strikes meant to look tough on camera. It went after the entire architecture that allows Iran to threaten that strait in the first place. Night after night, Central Command aircraft targeted military operations centers, coastal surveillance installations, missile and drone storage facilities, aircraft hangars, and logistics infrastructure stretching across Iran's entire southern coastline, from Bandar Abbas through Chabahar, Jask, and Bushehr. When you look at the footage that has come out of these strikes, you start to understand the sheer scale of what Iran had spent years quietly constructing, using oil revenue that mostly flowed in through its relationship with China. We are talking about hundreds of dispersed sites, ballistic missiles tucked into hillside bunkers, entire drone networks buried underground specifically engineered to survive exactly this kind of sustained bombing campaign. And for nearly 2 weeks straight, American forces worked through that target list with a level of consistency that is honestly the most important detail in this entire story. This did not look like scattered reactive strikes. It looked like a deliberate, methodical campaign to dismantle Iran's coastal strike capability piece by piece, night after night, until there was almost nothing left standing. But if there is one single moment from this entire stretch that made even seasoned defense analysts stop and take notice, it is the strike on an IRGC command bunker buried underground near Tehran. This was not one of the coastal strikes along the Gulf. This was deep inside Iranian territory, close to the capital itself, targeting a hardened facility where intelligence had reportedly identified a large concentration of senior commanders from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps gathering together in one place. You do not hit a target like that with a fighter jet carrying a couple of 2,000-pound bombs and hope for the best. To reach something buried that deep, under that much reinforced concrete and rock, you need the B-2 Spirit, and you need the GBU-57, more formally known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Just sit with the numbers on this weapon for a second, because it is genuinely one of the most extraordinary pieces of hardware in the entire American arsenal. 30,000 pounds. 15 tons of precision-guided bomb, engineered specifically to punch through layer after layer of hardened concrete before its warhead even detonates, so that by the time the explosion actually happens, the weapon is already buried deep inside whatever structure it was aimed at. Only one aircraft on Earth is even certified to carry this thing operationally, and that is the B-2, because you need that level of stealth to get something this size anywhere near heavily defended airspace and back out again in one piece. This was not the first time this exact pairing, B-2 bombers and GBU-57 bunker busters, had been used in this broader conflict. That same combination was used against Iran's nuclear infrastructure during the strikes that first triggered this entire chain of events, hitting hardened sites where inspectors later confirmed extremely severe damage. But using this weapon again here, against a leadership bunker instead of a static nuclear facility, tells you something important about how confident American commanders have become in their intelligence and their targeting chain. It tells you they are no longer reserving the biggest hammer in the toolbox strictly for buildings and infrastructure. They are willing to use it directly against the people running Iran's most aggressive and most dangerous paramilitary organization. The same organization responsible for harassing shipping, arming regional proxies, and enforcing brutal crackdowns on Iranian civilians at home. It's also worth understanding where this weapon actually comes from, because the GBU-57 has a track record in this conflict that goes back even further than most people realize. The very first operational use of this bomb happened during a strike campaign roughly a year earlier, when B-2 bombers flew a similar round-trip mission from the continental United States and dropped more than a dozen of these massive ordnance penetrators on Iran's most heavily fortified nuclear sites. At the time, officials described the damage to those facilities as extremely severe, though independent assessments differed on exactly how many months or years that set Iran's nuclear ambitions back. Some intelligence estimates suggested the program was delayed by only a matter of months. Others argued the setback was closer to a couple of years. That disagreement matters here because it explains something important about why this weapon keeps getting used again and again throughout this broader war. Nobody in the Pentagon believes a single strike, no matter how large the bomb, permanently ends a determined state's ability to rebuild. What the GBU-57 actually does is, by time, forcing an adversary to start over, to rebuild hardened facilities from scratch, and to sink resources into reconstruction instead of active weapons development. Using that same weapon again now against a leadership bunker rather than a nuclear site tells you the strategy has evolved from purely degrading infrastructure toward directly targeting the command structure that decides how Iran responds to all of this pressure in the first place. And this strike did not happen in a vacuum either. By multiple accounts, it occurred in the middle of an active rescue operation for 2 American service members whose F-15E had gone down inside Iranian territory. While recovery forces worked to extract those personnel safely, B-1 bombers were simultaneously dropping roughly 100 2,000-pound bombs just to keep Iranian ground forces away from the extraction zone, buying time and space for that rescue to actually happen. Stop and think about the level of coordination required to pull something like this off. You have a downed air crew on the ground, somewhere inside hostile territory. You have a recovery force moving in to get them out. You have B-1s laying down suppressive fire across the surrounding area to keep it clear of any Iranian response. And in the middle of all of that, time-sensitive intelligence comes in about a leadership gathering on the other side of the country, and commanders make the call, in real time, to redirect B-2 bombers toward that target while the rescue operation is still actively unfolding. That is not one mission. That is 3 or 4 separate operations layered directly on top of each other, all happening simultaneously, and by every account available, all of them succeeded. Both American crew members were reportedly recovered safely. Now let's talk about the B-1, because it has become an increasingly common presence as this campaign is stretched on. That matters more than people realize. The B-1 cannot carry the GBU-57. That capability is reserved strictly for the B-2. But what the B-1 lacks in bunker-penetrating power, it more than makes up for in raw payload capacity. This is a long-range supersonic bomber capable of hauling dozens of cruise missiles or tens of tons of conventional bombs in a single sortie. When Central Command confirmed that B-1s were joining the rotation during one of the later nights of this campaign, defense analysts immediately flagged it as a meaningful escalation. Because there is a difference between grinding steadily through the same categories of targets using fighter jets and drones and bringing in heavy bombers capable of saturating multiple targets across a wide geographic area in a single pass. That is the kind of asset you deploy when you want to compress the timeline, when you want to work through more of the target list faster instead of stretching the same campaign out across additional weeks. So who has actually been flying these missions, night after night, for this long? It has been a genuinely coordinated mix of platforms working in concert. F-35s conducting precision strikes while simultaneously using their advanced sensor suite to gather real-time intelligence on the exact same pass. F-16s, some specifically configured as Wild Weasels, whose entire mission is hunting enemy radar systems so that everything flying behind them can operate through that airspace safely. F-18s launching off carriers stationed in the Gulf, including strikes using air-launched cruise missiles that let pilots hit heavily defended targets from dozens of miles away without ever having to enter the most dangerous portions of Iranian airspace themselves. And feeding targeting information into all of it in real time, you have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, drones like the MQ-9 Reaper, and satellite coverage that helps confirm and refine targets as the picture develops. This is a genuinely networked style of warfare, where information gathered by one aircraft gets shared almost instantly with every other platform in the strike package. And that level of interoperability is a huge part of why Iran's air defense network has struggled so badly to keep pace. You can build all the underground bunkers you want, but if the other side can watch you moving equipment in and out of those bunkers from space and from drones circling overhead around the clock, that concealment only buys you so much time before someone finds you. Iran, to its credit from a purely military standpoint, has not simply absorbed all of this without responding. Tehran has retaliated on nearly every single night of this campaign, launching drones and ballistic missiles at American positions and allied nations spread across the region. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan have all had to activate their air defense systems repeatedly to intercept incoming projectiles. In one particularly serious exchange, Jordanian air defenses managed to intercept 8 out of 10 incoming threats, 6 missiles, and 4 drones, though 2 did land in open ground without causing significant damage. Bahrain's Interior Ministry reported sirens sounding as Iranian drones targeted the country's air navigation systems. And this exchange has not been one-sided in terms of casualties either, which is something that needs to be said plainly. American forces have taken real losses throughout this fighting. The Pentagon has confirmed multiple service members killed since the renewed campaign began in early July, including a 28-year-old staff sergeant from New York who was killed in an Iranian strike on an airbase in Jordan. Close to 100 additional American service members have suffered injuries of varying severity during this same stretch. So let's be honest about what all of this actually costs, because it matters. This is not some abstract exercise where explosions light up a screen and nothing real is at stake. Real families on both sides of this conflict have lost people, and that context belongs right alongside every single clip of a bunker getting vaporized, because that is the true price of a war like this one. The human toll inside Iran has been severe as well. State media has reported explosions and casualties across multiple provinces on a near-nightly basis throughout this campaign, and independent estimates place civilian and military deaths from this specific stretch of fighting well into the dozens, with the real figure almost certainly higher given how difficult it remains to get independent verification out of the country right now. And layered underneath all of this is something that genuinely deserves more attention than it gets, which is that even while absorbing this level of sustained bombardment from the air, the Iranian government has continued executing its own citizens, individuals connected to protest movements that trace back to earlier in the year. That is not a minor footnote buried at the bottom of this story. That is a regime showing you, in real time, exactly what its actual priorities are, even while under maximum external military pressure. But before we move past what Iran has actually lost in all of this, it's worth being honest about what it still has left, because a fair analysis does not pretend the other side has been completely disarmed. Independent estimates from groups tracking Iran's conventional military strength put its active duty troop numbers at roughly 570,000, with hundreds of thousands more in reserve. That is still one of the larger standing militaries in the entire region, even after weeks of sustained bombing. Iran also still fields a substantial stockpile of ballistic missiles, reportedly numbering in the thousands even after this campaign, along with drone production capacity that has proven remarkably resilient given how many storage sites have been destroyed. The country is enormous geographically, and hiding mobile launchers, dispersed drone components, and smaller missile stockpiles across that much territory is simply easier than fully eliminating them through air power alone, no matter how many nights of strikes you run. So while the coastal infrastructure most directly tied to threatening the Strait of Hormuz has been hit incredibly hard, describing Iran as fully defeated or incapable of further retaliation would be inaccurate and honestly a little irresponsible. Degraded is the more accurate word here, not disarmed. While all of this was unfolding on Iranian soil, a second front effectively forced its way open over in the Red Sea. The Iran-aligned Houthi movement in Yemen, which has spent years harassing international shipping in that region, jumped back into active combat directly. Houthi forces claimed responsibility for striking Saudi Aramco facilities in both Jizan and Yanbu, using a combination of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, describing the attacks as qualitative military operations. This came a day after Saudi Arabia struck Houthi positions inside Yemen, so on the surface, it looks like straightforward retaliation. But the bigger picture here is what it actually signals about Iranian strategy. Iran's proxy network across the region is working to spread pressure around, trying to make this feel less like a narrow bilateral fight between Washington and Tehran, and more like a sprawling regional conflagration that drags in Saudi oil infrastructure, a second critical maritime choke point at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and every insurance underwriter watching global shipping lanes at once. If the instability around the Strait of Hormuz was already rattling markets, now you potentially have two separate choke points creating uncertainty simultaneously. That is the exact kind of multi-front pressure Iran has relied on for years through its network of aligned militant groups, because it does not need to win any single engagement outright. It just needs to make the entire region feel unstable enough that someone, somewhere, starts pushing hard for concessions simply to calm things back down. And here is where the story takes a genuinely interesting turn, because after close to 2 straight weeks of nightly strikes, the pace of this campaign has actually stopped, at least for the moment. The United States has gone multiple consecutive days without launching new strikes on Iran, and Tehran says it has held its fire in return. Nobody in Washington has offered a full public explanation for why the pause happened when it did. The Pentagon has not provided a detailed rationale. But regional officials involved in mediation efforts are describing this pause as a positive signal, something that gives both sides genuine breathing room to get back to the negotiating table. And that negotiating table is not hypothetical or symbolic. Oman has reportedly been deeply involved in trying to broker a return to that original memorandum of understanding, with a potential compromise reportedly on the table that would let Iran continue managing vessel transit through the strait, but with fewer of the rigid routing requirements that helped spark this entire flare-up to begin with. The White House, for its part, has stuck to a fairly consistent line throughout, that the administration prefers a diplomatic resolution but retains every available option if Iran resumes what officials are calling terrorist activity against commercial shipping or allied military positions. In other words, the door to talks is open right now, but the aircraft and the bombers that carried out these bunker buster strikes have not gone anywhere, and they remain ready to resume this campaign on very short notice if that patience runs out. Layer on top of all this the fact that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reportedly traveling to Washington this week for his first face-to-face meeting with President Trump since the two countries launched the strikes back in February that killed Iran's supreme leader and effectively set this entire chain of events into motion. That is not a small, routine diplomatic meeting. And when the leaders of the two countries most directly responsible for driving military action against Iran sit down together right in the middle of a fragile pause in the fighting, that is exactly the kind of moment that could tip this entire situation in either direction, toward locking in a genuine diplomatic off-ramp, or toward coordinating the next phase of pressure if the current talks with Iran stall out. And there is an entirely separate front worth watching here too, because Hezbollah, Iran's other major regional proxy, got pulled into this broader war almost immediately after it started back in February, which then drew Israeli ground forces into southern Lebanon. The United States has been quietly supporting direct talks between Lebanon and Israel aimed at calming that particular front and working toward disarming Hezbollah entirely. So you genuinely have multiple fronts being managed simultaneously right now: Iran itself, the Strait of Hormuz, the Houthis and the Red Sea, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and none of these exist in complete isolation from each other. Pressure applied on one front tends to ripple outward into the others, which is exactly why a pause like the one happening right now feels so fragile. One miscalculated strike, one rogue Houthi launch that goes further than intended, one collapsed negotiating session, and this entire campaign could be right back to nightly bombing runs within days. So let's actually think through, honestly and carefully, where this realistically goes from here, because there are a few genuinely distinct paths, and it is worth walking through each one rather than just assuming the most dramatic outcome is automatically the most likely. The first path is the one almost everyone following this conflict is hoping for, which is that this current pause holds negotiators working through Oman manage to thread the needle on a Strait of Hormuz arrangement that both sides can actually accept, and the interim memorandum of understanding gets restored, this time in a form that actually sticks. There is a real argument to be made that Iran has more incentive than ever to lock in a deal right now, given how much of its coastal military infrastructure has already been dismantled over these past 2 weeks. Every additional night of bombing erases more of what little leverage Tehran has left to credibly threaten that strait at all. The second path is that this current pause is tactical rather than a genuine step toward peace, essentially Iran buying time to reconstitute its remaining assets, quietly relocate whatever equipment survived, and regroup before testing the waters again with another strike on a vessel or another attack on an allied position somewhere in the region. This is a pattern that anyone who has followed this conflict closely has seen play out before. Iran requests a pause, gets some measure of relief, and then uses that exact window to bring in excavators, clear debris out of bombed bunkers, and quietly reposition whatever is left of its arsenal before opening fire again, once it feels the moment is right. If that is what is actually happening behind the scenes right now, then this pause is not peace at all. It is a reload, and the next flare-up could come without much warning whatsoever. And the third path, the one that has reportedly been discussed at the highest levels of the American government but has not yet actually happened, is a genuine escalation beyond anything seen so far in this entire conflict. Something described in private discussions as bigger than any single operation launched against Iran up to this point. That conversation reportedly took place right before the current pause began, which makes this stretch of quiet feel less like relief and more like a held breath across the entire region. If negotiations collapse again, the infrastructure for a much larger campaign, additional fighter squadrons already staged in theater, more bomber assets on standby, logistics chains already stretched across multiple bases, all of that groundwork is already in place and ready to be activated on extremely short notice. It is also worth thinking through what all of this pressure is doing to Iran's own internal stability, because a government facing sustained military pressure from the outside, while also dealing with unresolved domestic unrest from earlier protest movements, is operating from a genuinely precarious position. Continuing to execute protesters while your coastal military infrastructure gets systematically dismantled night after night is not the behavior of a government that feels secure in its footing. It is the behavior of a government trying to maintain control primarily through fear, precisely because its other traditional levers of control, economic stability, credible military deterrence, standing within the region, have all been substantially weakened over the course of this year. Whether that internal pressure eventually translates into something larger inside the country remains genuinely uncertain, and it is a question that regional analysts have been debating without a clean answer for months now. But it is undeniably a factor shaping exactly how much additional risk Tehran's leadership is willing to absorb before deciding that negotiation is genuinely preferable to continued confrontation with a military that has already shown it can reach almost anywhere inside the country, day or night. On the diplomatic side, it is worth naming exactly who has been trying to hold this fragile peace together, because it has not just been American and Iranian officials talking directly to each other. Oman has taken the lead role as the primary mediator throughout this entire conflict, drawing on decades of relative trust from both Washington and Tehran to shuttle proposals back and forth. But Qatar and Egypt have also been pulled into that mediating role at various points, and Pakistan has shown up in some of the more recent diplomatic contacts as well, reflecting just how many regional powers now have a direct stake in preventing this conflict from spiraling any further out of control. Every one of those countries has its own reasons for wanting this resolved. Qatar and its neighbors depend heavily on stable shipping lanes for their own economies. Egypt has the Suez Canal to worry about if instability keeps spreading. And nobody in the Gulf wants to be the next country absorbing a stray missile or an intercepted drone because Iran decided to widen its target list again. That shared interest is part of why there has been this much diplomatic energy poured into brokering even a temporary pause, let alone a lasting deal. There is also the economic dimension underlying all of this, and it may ultimately prove just as decisive as anything happening in the skies above Iran. The naval blockade enforced against Iranian ports throughout this conflict has already been estimated to have cost Iran billions of dollars in lost oil revenue, and every additional day that traffic through the Strait of Hormuz stays suppressed compounds that financial pain even further. Insurance underwriters covering vessels transiting these waters have already adjusted risk premiums sharply upward, and some shipping companies have simply chosen to reroute entirely around the southern tip of Africa rather than risk a transit through waters this contested, adding weeks to delivery times and driving up costs that eventually get passed down to consumers far outside the region. Governments can absorb an enormous amount of military pressure if they genuinely believe their underlying economy can outlast the campaign against them. It becomes far harder to absorb that same pressure when the economy and the military situation are both deteriorating at the same time. That is arguably the single most important lesson to take away from these past several weeks. This was never just about degrading missile sites and drone storage bunkers, although that mattered enormously on its own. It was about squeezing every available pressure point simultaneously, military, economic, and diplomatic, all at once, in an effort to force an actual decision point, rather than allow this to drag on indefinitely the way so many conflicts in this region have dragged on in the past. So where does all of this leave things right now, at this exact moment? A pause that is holding for now. Negotiators actively working through Oman. A high-stakes meeting between Trump and Netanyahu on the calendar this week. Houthi attacks threatening to widen this war into a second maritime choke point entirely. And the very real possibility of an even larger American operation waiting in reserve if diplomacy collapses again. That is about as fragile and consequential a moment as this conflict has produced since it first erupted back in February. Nobody who has been following this closely is under any illusion that it is actually over. It is a pause, not a resolution. And the pattern of this exact war over these past several months has shown that pauses tend to have a fairly short shelf life whenever Iran feels it still has some leverage left worth testing. So here is the real question worth sitting with. Does this pause actually hold and turn into something lasting? Or is this simply the calm before an even bigger round of strikes, potentially the largest one yet, the one that has reportedly already been discussed behind closed doors in Washington? Drop your honest takedown in the comments, because informed opinion on where this goes next is genuinely split right now, even among people who follow this conflict for a living. And if this breakdown actually helped you understand what has been happening over these past 2 weeks instead of leaving you lost in a pile of confusing headlines about explosions in the Gulf, do go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who has been trying to keep up with this war and struggling to make sense of it, and make sure you are subscribed so you catch the next update the moment something shifts. Because given the pace this conflict has moved at so far, that next major development could come far sooner than anyone currently expects. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.